1183. Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Crusader Jerusalem, is only 22 years old, but he is near death. Through courage and dedication, the young king has protected Jerusalem and successfully defended his lands from the attacks of Saladin, the powerful Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt and Syria. However, Saladin's power is increasing, and Baldwin's health is declining. As leprosy ravages the king's body, he faces the problem of the succession. His sister and heir, Princess Sibylla, is married to a young knight, Guy of Lusignan, but Guy is mistrusted by many of the nobles in the kingdom. Can Baldwin trust Sibylla and Guy to rule wisely after he is gone? From his wealthy capital in Egypt, Saladin waits for the right moment to strike. Will Baldwin be able to save his kingdom? Today, in this final episode in our series on the life of the Leper King, we'll examine the last years of Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem. From the start of his rule, Baldwin IV worked to prevent his neighbor and enemy, the Sultan Saladin, from conquering Jerusalem and from extending his power in northern Syria. At the start of 1183, Baldwin had been successful in this. Despite Saladin's immense resources, the Sultan had been unable to conquer the Crusader kingdom and had failed to take control of the most important cities of his chief Muslim rivals, the Zengids. Now, Saladin was once again trying to break the power of the Zengids in Aleppo and Mosul. Baldwin had forged an alliance with the Muslim Zengid dynasty and was cooperating with them in curbing Saladin's ambitions. Over the winter of 1182, Saladin subdued many fortresses between Mosul and Aleppo, effectively dividing the two great Zengid cities. Meanwhile, one of Baldwin's vassals, Reynald of Chatillon, made a bold move to disrupt Saladin's policy. At his desert castle of Kerak, Reynald's men built a fleet of 5 warships in sections. This was an expensive undertaking involving skilled shipwrights from the coastal cities. King Baldwin surely knew about this project and must have helped fund it. Reynald's forces transported the ships on the backs of camels across the desert to the Gulf of Aqaba. Here, the ships were assembled and launched onto the Red Sea, where no Christian ship had ventured since the Muslim conquest of Egypt 5 centuries earlier. The Red Sea was famously dangerous, and Reynald employed Arab pilots who knew the waters well. Each galley contained groups of fighting men. There were no Muslim warships in the area, and the coastal cities were unwalled. This was a region that Saladin never imagined could be attacked, and that was exactly why Reynald selected it. 2 of Reynald's ships blockaded the castle of Pharaoh's Island in the Gulf of Aqaba. Reynald himself did not join in the naval campaign, but blockaded the port of Eilat with his land forces. The other 3 warships cruised into the Red Sea and ravaged more than a dozen Muslim merchant ships. They then sacked Adhab, crowded with pilgrims bound for Mecca. Finally, they struck inland and captured a caravan, slaughtering all of its members. The fleet then crossed the Red Sea and continued its reign of terror. At Mecca, people panicked, for the pirates seemed headed for Mecca itself. Saladin's regime handled the situation effectively. The Sultan's brother, Al-Adil, dispatched Egyptian warships onto the Red Sea. Reynald withdrew with the land forces back to Transjordan, while some crew members of the Christian ships fled and made their escape. The Ayyubids managed to destroy Reynald's ships and capture many of his troops. Saladin ordered all of these prisoners paraded through the cities of Egypt and then decapitated. Historian Andrew Ehrenkreutz writes that Saladin's rapid defeat of Reynald's campaign did as much as any other single event to increase Saladin's reputation as the defender of Islam against the infidels. However, not everyone in the Muslim world felt this way. For some, Saladin's own long-running war with the Zengids was to blame for allowing this shocking raid to occur at all. Throughout this period, Saladin remained in Zengid territory, campaigning against Mosul's ruler, Izz ad-Din. Saladin was hoping to gain the approval of the Abbasid Caliph in his war against the Zengids. But the Caliph an-Nasir sent a messenger to Mosul, asking Saladin to stop his attacks on the city. Saladin broke off his invasion in February of 1183. For the time being, Aleppo and Mosul remained out of Saladin's reach. Historian Bernard Hamilton states that Reynald had shown that the Ayyubids could not protect the Hajj because of Saladin's political ambitions in northern Syria and Iraq. In some circles of the Muslim world, this injured the Sultan's public image. For years, the Zengids themselves had been complaining that Saladin was waging an unjust war against their rightful rule in the north of Syria and Iraq. The events of 1182 had greatly strained the resources of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. When the king gathered the high court in February of 1183, it was agreed that a general tax would be leveled to bolster the kingdom's defenses. Meanwhile, the chronicler William of Tyre reports that the king's leprosy was worse than ever.
The king lost his sight, and the extremities of his body became completely diseased and damaged, so that he was unable to use his hands and feet. Yet, although some people suggested to him that he should abdicate and lead a retired life, he refused to surrender either the royal office or the government of the kingdom, for although his body was weak and powerless, he was strong in spirit and made a superhuman effort to disguise his illness and shoulder the burdens of kingship.
In May, Saladin resumed his campaign against the Zengids. His recent conquests had cut Aleppo off from Mosul, and so the Sultan was able to fully blockade Aleppo. Izz ad-Din of Mosul's brother, Imad ad-Din, who governed Aleppo on behalf of the Zengids, was left with little option but to sit and watch his city starve. Instead, he struck a deal with Saladin, surrendering in exchange for the fief of Sinjar. Ibn al-Athir records Zengid disappointment.
Imad ad-Din gave up a fortress like Aleppo and received in exchange some villages and fields. He left and Saladin took it over. Everyone was amazed at this and condemned what he had done. Indeed, some of the common people of Aleppo brought a tub of water and shouted out, "You are not fit to rule, you are only fit to wash clothes."
On June 12, 1183, Saladin's forces took control of Aleppo. Finally, the Sultan had broken this great Zengid stronghold. It was a moment of profound triumph, expanding Saladin's already powerful empire. As the Sultan rode into Aleppo, it must have been a moment of sheer exhilaration. News of Saladin's conquest of Aleppo fell upon the kingdom of Jerusalem like a black cloud. But Baldwin and his subjects had little time to dwell on the matter, for they soon learned that Saladin, fresh from his triumph, was once again assembling his army for another invasion of the Crusader kingdom. The king summoned the army to Sepphoris. Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch both sent knights, and tax funds paid for mercenaries to increase the ranks. The total Frankish army came to about 1,300 cavalry and 15,000 infantry, but King Baldwin felt so ill he could not join the army. His mother attended him at Nazareth, and he lay feverish in bed. Everyone believed he would soon die. With Saladin stronger than ever, now approaching with his army, it was an ominous situation. King Baldwin chose a regent to rule for him. William of Tyre records,
The king appointed Guy of Lusignan regent of the kingdom, ordering all his liegemen and all the princes in general that they should become his vassals and do him homage. And this was done, but first, by the king's command, Guy was made to swear that during Baldwin's lifetime he would never seek to make himself king, and that he would neither give to anyone else nor alienate from the royal treasury any of the cities and castles which the king at present possessed.
William of Tyre claims that these conditions were imposed because there were rumors that Guy had promised portions of the royal domain to his supporters. William held a low opinion of Guy, writing,
He was unequal in strength and wisdom to the great burden he had taken upon himself.
Guy of Lusignan was now commander-in-chief of the army. It was imperative that he rise to the challenge of Saladin's invasion. Success in the field would silence his critics and strengthen his position as Baldwin's successor. But Guy lacked experience. So far, he'd not even led a large-scale raid. On September 17, 1183, Saladin's army massed just south of Damascus in preparation to invade the Christian kingdom. Saladin crossed the Jordan River on September 29 and marched to Bethsan, the inhabitants of which fled to Tiberias. Meanwhile, the Frankish army drew toward La Fève. Saladin's army was considerably larger than the Crusader force. The Sultan dispatched an advanced cavalry of some 500 to harass the marching Crusaders. The Franks maintained impeccable order, the cavalry marching in the center, screened by armored infantry with large shields. The Sultan's advanced force failed to goad the Christians into an early charge. As the Crusaders drew towards Saladin's host, a minor skirmish broke out between Ayyubid horsemen and Aymery of Lusignan's knights. Aymery received support from the Ibelin brothers, Baldwin and Balian, and together they drove back Saladin's cavalry. For 9 days, such skirmishes broke out between the two sides. At times, the fighting turned fierce, and there were casualties in both camps. The Sultan dispatched parties of horsemen to pillage around Fort Belay. Saladin tried to provoke the Christians into battle, but they held a firm and defensible position. On October 7, the Sultan marched to Mount Tabor, again trying to tempt the Crusaders into following, but they refused. Low on supplies, Saladin decided to retreat. He crossed the Jordan and was back in Damascus by October 14. The Franks now returned to Sepphoris, where they remained mustered for some days, concerned that the Sultan might return for another attack. Strategically, the Crusader army had performed quite well. Saladin's enormous army had invaded Galilee, but achieved little, pushed back by a cohesive Frankish army that sustained no significant losses. Defying all expectations, King Baldwin recovered from his fever. He was not happy with the outcome of Guy's clash with Saladin. William of Tyre states that the king believed Guy had handled the campaign incompetently. Baldwin dissolved Guy's power as regent, resuming full power himself. Baldwin seems to have believed that Guy had lost a key opportunity to inflict a decisive defeat on Saladin. This was no mere border skirmish. The kingdom's army was fully mustered at great expense and was well positioned to engage the Sultan's host head-on. Many of the leading nobles felt that Saladin had been reckless and, as at Montgisard, had left himself open to disaster. Perhaps if a decisive attack had been attempted, Saladin's army could have been annihilated. Not everyone agreed. Some members of the High Court felt that Saladin was too well positioned and that attacking him would have led to disaster. But the king was one of those that felt otherwise. Baldwin lost all trust in Guy for failing to attack Saladin. This is striking, given the popular image created by the film Kingdom of Heaven, which depicts the opposite. Baldwin worried that Guy might start a war with the Muslims. To solidify his new policy, Baldwin had his 5-year-old nephew, son of Sibylla, crowned alongside him in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on November 20, 1183, as King Baldwin V of Jerusalem. In this, Baldwin was widely supported by the High Court, with Bohemond III, Raymond III, and Baldwin and Balian of Ibelin all agreeing with the decision. Baldwin now took steps to isolate Guy, with the likely goal of driving him from the kingdom. The Leper King asked the Patriarch of Jerusalem to review the marriage between Sibylla and Guy, and to hopefully have it annulled. But more pressing matters arose. Saladin again assembled his army and launched another invasion, this time targeting the frontier fortress of Kerak. Baldwin recognized the enormity of this threat. Now blind and lame, the king still led his men. Unable to ride, he was carried on a litter at the head of his marching troops. Saladin wanted Kerak. The castle had been a thorn in his side since he'd captured Damascus, but Kerak was no easy conquest. The castle was enormous and incorporated the most sophisticated features of Frankish fortification. Even today, the ruins of Kerak present an imposing sight. Saladin gathered a large Syrian army to attack the castle. Ibn al-Athir recounts the campaign.
Saladin came to Kerak during Rajab, where he was joined by his brother Al-Adil with the Egyptian army. His combined army was numerous, and he imposed a tight blockade. The Muslims got into the suburb and took control of it, pressing the siege of the fortress from the suburb and gaining the upper hand in the battle. 7 trebuchets were set up which continued to hurl stones night and day.
The Christian army advanced toward Kerak, the relic of the true cross of Christ carried before them. By the time they reached the Dead Sea, King Baldwin was seriously ill and gave command to Raymond III of Tripoli. On December 4, Saladin learned of the approach of the Crusader army, and after a month-long siege, decided to retreat. Guy had been with the relief army, but as soon as the Kerak campaign ended, he fled to Ashkelon, sending a message for Sibylla to join him. Guy feared that once Baldwin returned to Jerusalem, he would never permit Sibylla to see him again. Sibylla faithfully joined her husband at Ashkelon. The king summoned Guy to a personal meeting. Guy refused, claiming illness, which must have struck Baldwin as rich. King Baldwin traveled to Ashkelon, demanding entry. Guy refused to open the gate. Baldwin had himself carried on his litter to the gate and personally knocked on the door. The purpose of this gesture, which was witnessed by many of the townspeople standing on the wall, was to highlight Guy's disobedience and justify the king in divesting Guy of his fief. Baldwin now traveled to Jaffa, where the garrison opened the gate to him without question. The king dismissed Guy's garrison and appointed his own governor. Baldwin next traveled to Acre and assembled the high court. Here, he formally motioned for Guy to be dispossessed as a recalcitrant vassal. In June of 1184, Baldwin sent the masters of the temple and the hospital, along with Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem, on a mission to the west to seek the help of a new crusade against Saladin. In particular, the mission was to focus on King Henry II of England, Baldwin's relative. Baldwin hoped to prompt a sense of duty in the powerful English king, who was enormously wealthy and ruled half of France. Henry had already contributed much financially to the kingdom of Jerusalem, but Baldwin wanted his royal cousin to come himself to the relief of the Holy Land. By August, Saladin was again besieging Kerak. Baldwin was unable to rise from his bed, but still he led the army, carried on a litter for the whole of the grueling march. Defended by Reynald of Chatillon, Kerak held strong. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir records the siege and subsequent events.
The Franks set out by night for Kerak, and when Saladin learned of that, he realized that he was not going to gain the upper hand on this occasion, nor attain any objective. He proceeded to Nablus and plundered all the land on his route. Having arrived at Nablus, he set fire to it, destroyed and sacked it. He killed, captured, and enslaved many there.
Saladin withdrew to Damascus. The Leper King oversaw the restoration of Kerak's moat and granted Reynald of Chatillon a large subsidy to repair the damaged outer wall. At this time, Guy still stubbornly held to Ashkelon. Despite his unpopularity, he had some supporters in the high court arguing on his behalf and trying to prevent the king from fully divesting him from his fief. Then, on October 6, 1184, Guy of Lusignan launched a raid from Ashkelon, attacking Bedouin near the royal fief of Darum on the edge of the Sinai Desert. These Bedouin were under the kingdom's protection, and the raid was a vengeful act in response to Baldwin's moves to have Guy divested from his fief. The king was furious. The Bedouin were strong allies of the kingdom, who spied on Saladin and provided crucial intelligence to the Crusaders. The stupidity of Guy's raid only served to highlight his unfitness for the throne. As 1184 drew to a close, Baldwin's health declined rapidly. By early 1185, it was clear that he was dying. The high court assembled around his bed, while the king dictated his final will. The chronicler Ernul describes the scene.
The members of the High Court said, "We do not wish that when the child has been crowned, that his stepfather, Guy of Lusignan, should be regent, because we know that he would have neither the knowledge nor the ability to govern the kingdom." Then the king said, "Decide among yourselves whom I should appoint as regent for the child." They decided that nobody could rule as well as the Count of Tripoli. So the king sent for the count and asked him to act as regent of the kingdom and of the child king for 10 years until the child came of age.
In his presence, Baldwin had the high court do homage before the little king Baldwin V and the Count of Tripoli. Raymond III had been regent for Baldwin IV. Now, he would be regent again. The High Court imposed certain limits on Tripoli, like giving the Templars and the Hospitallers control of the kingdom's castles during the regency, and appointing Jocelyn of Courtenay as Baldwin V's guardian. But even after their disagreements and even conflicts, Baldwin does seem to have trusted his cousin, Raymond III. Certainly, the king now regretted ever allowing Guy of Lusignan to marry his sister. Raymond was one of the most senior members of the royal family and a proven and competent commander. It's no surprise that he resumed his role as regent for the kingdom. This business settled, the high court remained in Jerusalem, and the leper king suffered his final illness. Baldwin IV, at the end of his life, had done all that he could to secure the kingdom he so faithfully protected throughout his reign. He had dispatched a mission to the west to seek the aid of a new crusade. He had secured the throne for his nephew and attained the high court's approval for a regency. He had personally repelled one final attack during his reign on the frontier by his enemy, Saladin, and he had legally barred Guy of Lusignan from ever taking the throne. Despite the immensity of his personal suffering, Baldwin the Leper had once again demonstrated why he was so universally respected. Before Baldwin died, the High Court gathered one last time at his bedside to honor the courageous young man who had successfully guarded over Jerusalem for 11 years. The handsome, athletic youth crowned in 1174 was barely recognizable. Leprosy had all but destroyed his body, rendering him crippled and deprived of most of his senses. And yet, to the last, he remained active and took steps to secure the realm. Bernard Hamilton puts it best: few rulers have remained executive heads of state when handicapped by such severe physical disabilities or sacrificed themselves more totally to the needs of their people. During Baldwin's reign, his kingdom had been strong. Far from a waning state barely clinging to life, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was economically prosperous, with a capable military well led by its king. In the face of the overwhelming power of Saladin, the kingdom stood firm under a capable ruler. The great issue Baldwin ultimately could not solve was the problem of the succession, a legacy of his leprosy. He died young, leaving no children, with his nephew and heir still a small boy. With the leper king gone, the problem of factionalism would reemerge. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died sometime between March and May of 1185. He was not yet 24 years old. The king was buried near his father in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's death and resurrection, and the heart of the kingdom. Baldwin ruled during the most difficult period yet experienced by the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and he triumphed. He faced no less an opponent than Saladin, ruler of a vast, wealthy empire, and yet the leper king emerged victorious again and again. Always Baldwin's forces were outnumbered by the huge armies of the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and yet, led by this stricken youth, the Crusaders prevailed. The most competent of kings would have had a difficult time dealing with Saladin, one of the most outstanding rulers in history. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem lived up to that challenge. Today, Baldwin the Leper King of Jerusalem is remembered for his heroism, his dedication, and his faith. He remains an inspiration to many, a symbol of valor in the face of danger, and victory in the face of the impossible. The Battle of Montgisard remains the best symbol of his reign, when the teenage Leper King, flanked by a small band of Templars and Knights, charged the vast forces of Saladin and won. Thanks for watching. Now, check out our full-length documentary on the life of Charlemagne, the great founding emperor of medieval Europe. Click on the video linked on your screen right now to watch. Click on the link to our Patreon to support our work, ask me questions, and get exclusive behind-the-scenes content.